It's Radio Free 501c, the podcast of Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sapp, and we're so excited to be back for Season 6 and continue bringing you outstanding ideas and thought leaders and different ways of thinking. So don't forget to subscribe because you're not going to want to miss any of it. This week I'm joined by first-time guest Michael Randel. He's a nonprofit consultant, and he's here to talk with us about how to create a foundation for growth. And we're going to talk about the Prepared Organization. It's June 17th, 2024. Welcome to episode 243. Hey everybody, it's Monday, June 17th, and that means it's time for another episode of Radio Free 501c, brought to you by Rogue Tulips Consulting. I'm your host, Cecilia Sepp. I'm a CAE and ACNP, and I also happen to be the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips. Thanks for joining us this week, and to our global audience, wherever you may be, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and thanks again, everyone, for joining us. This week, we have first-time guest, consultant Michael Randel, and we're going to be discussing creating a foundation for growth, because that is what is important to pretty much any organization, nonprofit or for-profit. And Michael's approach can help any size organization. But before we jump into that topic, Michael, welcome to the show. Glad to have you. We had a wonderful conversation as we prepared for this episode. I really enjoyed getting to know you. So would you like to say hello to our audience and tell us a little about yourself?
So I'm Michael Randel, as Cecilia said, and I'm in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., from where I have my consulting practice, which is called Randel Consulting Associates. And what I do is I work with leaders and their teams as they're going through growth and change. And I help them to do that with calm and confidence. I work with all kinds of organizations, but mostly from the social sector. So nonprofits of different kinds, as well as philanthropic foundations.
So you often talk about the prepared organization, and you came up with 6 steps to help an organization move forward with that common confidence that you mentioned. But what inspired you to develop this approach to working with organizations for change and growing?
That's a great question, Cecilia. So there's a long answer and a short answer. And the shorter answer is that I've been part of organizations and working with organizations and in organizations for about 30 years, since the beginning of my career. And along the way, I've come across many organizations that have grown rapidly because of new funding opportunities or a charismatic leader, but then they're not able to sustain that growth in size and capacity. So when I began looking at those, I kind of got a sense of some of the fundamentals were not in place. It would be like fueling a fire by adding gasoline to it. It'll jump up quickly, but it'll burn through it very, very fast. More recently, in the last maybe 2 years or 3 years, I noticed that a number of my clients and former clients were receiving transformational gifts from Mackenzie Scott. So you can imagine that's a great surprise for them because they didn't apply for these gifts, but they were getting $2 million, $5 million, $10 million, even $50 million.
And let me interrupt for a second there. For the members of the audience who don't know who Mackenzie Scott is and what she's doing, could you explain that for us?
Yes. So Mackenzie Scott is a philanthropist. She has a large fortune that became available to her, and she decided that she could make best use of it by giving it away. And rather than creating a traditional foundation and having people apply for grants and all the rest of it, she decided to engage in what people are calling trust-based philanthropy. So she was identifying organizations that were doing work that she valued, and then she trusted them to know how best to use the resources she donated to them. So they didn't apply, but one day they would receive a message saying that an anonymous donor had a gift for them. And lo and behold, it would be Mackenzie Scott, and she would give them a whole sum of money, as I said, several $1 million in cash, into their bank account on day one, without any expectations for reporting or anything like that. So a real trust that these organizations knew how best to use that money in support of their mission.
That is amazing. And for those of you who are wondering how she came into this fortune, she co-founded Amazon with her former husband, Jeff Bezos. And so that is why she has this large fortune and from the beginning has offered to share it with the rest of the world. So that's wonderful. But I can imagine, Michael, when you're working with one of these clients who wasn't expecting such a large gift, maybe they're a smaller foundation or charity, and they're going, what the heck? Oh my gosh, what are we going to do with this? So then that is where you come in and help them, right?
That's right. That's right. And again, it comes back to my long-term interest in how do we build and support organizations that can be impactful over the long term, right? So one part of that is having a very strong foundation.
Mhm.
And so as I began talking to these organizations that were receiving these funds, I began to notice some things in common among them. And it, along with some other work that I'd done, it kind of helped me clarify what are some of the elements that organizations put into place that prepares them for growth, right? So that when the funding arrives, whether it's Mackenzie Scott, whether it is a contract that you might have from an agency to provide services, whether it's more traditional philanthropy, you know how to use those funds. And in expanding your organization, you're actually not putting it at risk by growing too fast or growing in the wrong ways, because you've got all of these interlocked elements in place to support and sustain the work of growth.
Now, I would imagine you said there are 6 steps that you use to help organizations be prepared. I would imagine that those could be applied in other areas of the organization besides money management. Would that be correct?
Yes, that's right. And money is obviously important, but think of it as a lubricant or an enabler for the organization's work. But it shouldn't be the thing that's driving the organization.
Mm-hmm.
So the really important starting point, I think, is what I call purpose and identity. Do you know who you are as an organization? Right? Are you clear about what distinguishes you from other organizations and what distinguishes you from other different kinds of service providers? I'll make one example, and this is not a client of mine, but they did receive a Mackenzie Scott gift. There used to be a relatively traditional after-school program. So they would hire people to go into schools in a city. They would run after-school programming, helping the kids with homework, with other forms of support. And it was fairly intensive to be able to grow and expand that work, right? Because it's people dependent. Over a number of years, they did a very big pivot. They are now an education technology organization, right?
Wow.
So they stopped having local city programming,
Mhm.
but they took the essence of what they were about. Like, we know how to support kids very well after school. So they took that programming, that curriculum, all of those insights, put it into software, and now that software fuels dozens of other organizations. So they've gone from maybe being able to serve 15,000 young people, and now they're serving well over 100,000, but without having to grow in a small piece by piece fashion. One of the things, though, that they did was not just, oh, we can do this by technology, but they shifted their identity. They actually let many of their staff go because they didn't have the skills and capabilities needed for an education technology organization. They began hiring software programmers and things like that, right? So they were very clear that our shift in identity is going to require a different orientation, a different skill set, and they were able to make that move, right? Compared to many organizations that kind of feel confused or ambiguous. And they might try and hold an element, part of the old identity with part of a new identity, and just end up confused. So
Mhm.
I think it's really important to get clear and have everybody in the organization understand what we're about and who we are in doing that.
Well, and then the identity shift means, as you just said, the people might need to shift too. I think a lot of organizations don't think of it that way. I think they try to keep the same staff for a lot of different reasons, loyalty, maybe they have other skills, but sometimes if you're shifting the whole identity, you definitely need a different team. I mean, it's basically using a sports analogy. If you're going to play baseball, then you need baseball players. So you have to get rid of the soccer players if you've been playing soccer. So I think that's really good that you advise people on that, hey, we've got to go in this other direction. So what would be the next step after that? So we know who we are. So what would we do next?
Right. So this piece of identity, is crucial because it says this is what we're about. This is helping us work out who we work with and the ways in which we help them. Right. So that means that some things will be in your scope of work and some things will be clearly outside of it. Mm-hmm. So then strategy follows as the next piece because you know who your audience is. And so strategy is not just where shall we do our work, but who can benefit from our work? Where are they located? What are they grappling with? Or what are the opportunities that they have? And how can we best support them? So really, there's a close relationship between identity and strategy, right? But strategy should really, again, follow on from purpose and identity rather than be the thing that drives the identity.
Yes, yes, I agree with that. I think too many people get driven by their strategy instead of realizing that's not why we have strategy.
Right. And often strategy is driven by external funding, right? So organizations end up being a little bit of a holiday tree with kind of all sorts of different things on it, because that reflects the interests of their funders, not necessarily the core identity and purpose of the organization itself.
Yes. Yeah, that external pressure really does force organizations to get distracted, in my opinion. I think that people make demands. Donors are known for saying, well, I want you to do it this way, and just because we gave you the money. And I think so often, especially in nonprofits, we feel like we have to do what we're told, as opposed to sitting down and having that conversation and saying, well, we really appreciate you giving us this money, but that's not necessarily how we do things. Can we work something out? So it sounds like, your steps for the prepared organization might also prepare them for those kind of conversations.
That's right. Yeah, and I think it helps the organizations be ready to go out and help identify who are their ideal funders, right? So that they're not simply accepting any funding that comes in their direction, but they're being clear and strategic. Cultivating the funders that understand their vision and what they're trying to do, and not contorting themselves in order to get a quick grant in the house that actually is distracting them from the core work they're trying to do.
Yes. And I think, yes, distraction. It's not just for your smartphone. Where we're running our organizations, we become easily distracted. I think even as a solopreneur working on my own company, I find myself getting distracted. I go in to do one email and then find myself writing another one and completely forgetting the first one because we're constantly shifting. So that's very interesting. What would be the third step in your process?
Yeah. Well, I think the next two probably follow on from that, right? So if we know who we are and we know what we're trying to do, we want to then make sure that we have an approach that works, right? As well as having leadership that are aligned around the purpose and the strategy. So both the work that we do and our leaders are all working towards the same thing. I want to be cautious when I talk about approaches, because sometimes there can be a temptation to say, well, we've got to get the one right way of doing it, and we take that everywhere. Once we've kind of ironed all the kinks out, it'll be ideal and applicable in every single situation. And I very much doubt that. Right? I think that while there may be some principles and certainly values at the heart of the approach, you can't assume that what you've been able to develop and mature in one place automatically applies in another setting, because that means you're not paying attention to the people, to the particular situation in the new place. So I think it's more helpful to go in saying, we know how to do these things, but here's how we start. Right. And being open to adapt and tailor, or maybe even innovate something new, as long as it's in line with your purpose and strategy and keyed into your stakeholders and the people you're trying to support.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that, Michael, because sure, there are certain basic steps we will use when we're trying to solve any problem or answer any question, I do a lot of research, for example. So there are certain research tools that we almost always use. But does that mean I'm always going to ask the same questions? No. Does that mean I'm going to make the same recommendations? No. And I think a lot of times we fall prey to something called the equivalency fallacy, where we look at two things and think they're the same, and they're absolutely not alike at all. So coming into those situations and feeling like one size fits all, or well, this is the way we handled the other thing, also kind of reminds me of the Peter principle. Some people in the audience might be too young to remember that, but Peter Drucker wrote a book called The Peter Principle, which means you rise to the level of your own incompetence, which means you will eventually get to the point where you probably just keep doing the same thing over and over again if it works or not. And as we all know, Albert Einstein said that's the definition of insanity. So doing the same thing. So I really like this. So your steps. Now we've gone through the first four already.
Yeah.
I love the step-by-step process because it's a very clear way of thinking it through and a clear approach that anybody can use, no matter how their organization's set up or how they approach things. So then what would be the next steps, 5 and 6?
Yeah. Well, this is where the piece around the aligned leaders is so important, right? Because what we want is leaders who are thinking about the organization as a whole. They themselves are clear about purpose and strategy and how that all ties together, so that as they then lead their teams, the people in their teams are aligning with that direction and strategy. But very often what happens for organizations to be able to grow and to sustain that growth, you also have to develop and mature your people and your processes, right? So I'll give you a couple of examples of this. I have a client organization I worked with some years ago, and they enjoyed spectacular success. They doubled in size every year.
Wow.
Right?
Very impressive.
It was very impressive. But they were growing so rapidly, they didn't have time to develop people, right? So what you would have is somebody who was a recent college graduate, had maybe been working for the organization for 2 or 3 years. So they'd seen a lot of shifts and evolutions of the organization. But now they were being put in charge of a team of people as a supervisor or as a team leader without any development in being a leader, because the organization didn't have time for that. They were so busy trying to respond to the demand for their services. And that became a brake on that organization's growth and quality. So this is one example of that. Another example would be the financial system, right? Is everything being done by paper and pen? You'd be surprised at how many organizations still require a pen and ink signature to approve expenses, which then gets put into a paper check that gets mailed out, because there hasn't been time to update the financial system to allow supporting for a more digital period, a digital age, or a more distributed workforce, right? So again, that can be an impediment to sustaining growth.
That is when I'm sorry, I just don't even know how to respond to that, mailing checks out to people, because I do still run into clients who do that. They'd like to pay, by check, and I say, well, I can do ACH. And so, oh no, we do checks because I has to sign it. And then what I do with that check when it comes in the mail? I use my bank app on my phone to do mobile deposit. I don't necessarily have to countersign it. It gets deposited right into my account.
That's right.
That's really amazing to me that people still do that. Although I can see for internal controls, I can see having, a supervisor review expenses before they're approved. But
I'm not saying we don't have those appropriate checks and balances.
Yeah.
But I mean, I give one example. One of my client organizations has a budget now of about $100 million.
Oh my God.
Annual budget, right?
Wow.
And they're working globally, I believe in something like 60 countries, right? But they started off as a US domestic focused organization. And in many ways, their financial system still reflects that of a domestic US focused organization, right? So it takes them a long time to deal with kind of working out currency transactions when people are coming back to submit an expense report that might be in multiple currencies because they've been in 2 different countries. And again, that all has to be done via paper. So there are ways of streamlining it. And that really gets to my sixth element of being the prepared organization, which is about learning and adaptation. Right? So even when you are clear about what you're trying to do, you've got aligned leadership, you've got a good strategy, reality is never going to be the way that you anticipated it's going to be, whether in your strategic planning or your annual work planning. So it's really important to have the capacity to pay attention to what's happening, to make sense of the changes. Is this significant that we need to make an adjustment, or is it a small blip that we can carry on as planned? And then to be able to be agile and nimble as necessary.
Those are
So
two
that makes up the kind of the six elements that I think work together. But the starting point really is about the purpose identity piece along with strategy, and all the others flow from there.
That's really, I think it's an excellent outline. And when I almost interrupted you, what I was trying to say about nimble and agile, I've always considered those words of the 90s. But as time has gone on and the world continues to change at an increasingly rapid pace, those are the two words we need. We need that way beyond flexible or adaptable, even, although adaptation is key as well. But we need to be agile, meaning I know a lot of people during the lockdown did not like the word pivot, but I used to play basketball. Pivot's a very important thing to be able to do in basketball. You have to be able to pivot quickly to not lose control of the ball. So I think, though, the approach that often too many of us, even just as people in our own lives, take is like, well, this is the way we've always done it, or this is the plan. We can't change the plan. And of course, you can change the plan. And the beauty of your 6 steps toward the prepared organization is that it gives you that outline for being able to change, being able to adapt, being able to shift because you're prepared, which leads me to my next question for you. So, what advice do you give your clients after you initially work with them and you show them the prepared organization process? What advice do you give them to continue maintaining that preparation status so that they are always ready, no matter what happens?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a lot that happens for that. I think part of it comes out of the learning and adaptation. Part of it comes out of your strategic orientation, strategic thinking, right? So that you are paying attention to what's going on in your environment. So you spoke about the pandemic a few moments ago. Very few, if any, organizations were able to continue uninterrupted through the pandemic, right? What's interesting, of course, is organizations entered the pandemic at different points of time. There was the awareness of we need to make a change in how we do things because of the pandemic sometimes took longer to settle than for others. So I think very often people do try to kind of continue doing what they've always done, despite all the evidence around them. And this is, I think, part of the art and the judgment of leadership. When are we seeing a fad that's short term, that's temporary, that we can safely ignore? And when are we noticing maybe a shift of pattern or a shift of a trend that actually can be more impactful on us? And I think there's a really, really interesting experiment going on in organizations around the world right now. How do you recontract with your employees around whether or not you're a hybrid organization, whether you are a fully remote organization, how much time people need to be in a physical office, right? For many organizations, the assumption pre-2020 was, well, of course we're in the office 5 days a week, right? And, 8 hours a day. But the pandemic broke that paradigm. And I don't think anybody has quite yet stabilized into a new pattern that works really consistently. So as a leader, you're having to face the question of, if we're going to have a return to office policy, why are we having that?
Right.
What's going to be different for us if we're not all going to be in the office every single day? What do we do in the office that we can't do remotely? So there's all sorts of questions that I think people are kind of rushing through in this effort to get people back in the office, without thinking about what can we, how can we benefit by being a hybrid organization? What are we doing for, how does that impact on employee well-being or employee engagement by giving people more flexibility, by trusting them to know how to best manage their work and their personal lives.
And that's an excellent example of backsliding post-pandemic, in my opinion. The organizations who really understood what was happening and then realized, especially smaller associations, really saw this, the savings of not having to pay rent on a huge office space anymore, the savings of not needing to have huge storage spaces. You could get a smaller storage space, or you could get an executive office suite, which is much, much more affordable, especially in a dispersed organization. I was formerly a chief staff executive at what you call dispersed staff organization, was completely virtual. And we had an executive office suite in downtown Washington, D.C., and they got our mail and answered the phone for us. And people worked in several different states, Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, and then a couple of people in the DC area. So people were all over. What I saw was smaller organizations going completely virtual. It was their chance. They saw the chance and they took it, because maybe they'd been talking to the board about doing it before the lockdown, but then the lockdown gave them the evidence that they needed. We can do this, and look at all the cost savings we're going to have. And the staff will be working instead of commuting. Because I remember when I used to have to commute to an office, and I'm such a smart aleck, Michael, when you said, what are we getting at from all of us being in the office? And the first thing that came in my mind is, well, we can waste each other's time because we're all in the office interrupting each other. Many times I'd be in my office and someone would say, do you have a minute? And 45 minutes later, they're still there when I'm trying to get some work done. So that I think a lot of office dynamic became weird over time, because, people just felt like they had to be there, and maybe, are we really being productive? And frankly, if you're a productive person, you're going to be productive no matter where you work. If you're in the office, on the train, working at your dining room table, it doesn't matter. If you're focused on getting your work completed and doing what you need to do, then you're going to do it. It doesn't matter where you are. And I have other examples of that, but I won't bore the audience with them. But the other thing I did see was other groups, maybe not really small organizations, maybe a little bit almost mid-sized organization, embrace the opportunity to create that hybrid organization where maybe they got a smaller office and then people could come to the office, but they're not required to come to the office. I have a friend who works at a physicians organization, and they are required to be in the office 3 days a week, and 2 days a week they can work remotely. So it's a very clear policy, very well stated. You can do this, you can't do that. And so I think that some organizations really did use that opportunity to say, how are we going to handle this now that it's post-pandemic as well? What are we going to do? Well, we do kind of like that dynamic. I think really, though, a lot of people don't realize we don't live in the 19th century anymore. And you don't need to go to the office to get anything done. I've recently, anybody who reads my blog post will know I've recently broken my leg. I'm working from my bed because why? We live in a digital age. I can hook up my computer, I can connect my Wi-Fi, I can make phone calls. So really understanding the concept of putting together that team for the prepared organization that you can trust to do the work, that is going to have the skill set and the focus to follow through and get that work done. And I often differentiate between leaders and managers. Leaders tell you what your job is and then let you do it. And then managers are trying to control what you're doing. They're trying to tell you what to do. And they're the ones, that manager mindset, are the ones who say, well, how do I know you're doing your work if you're working from home? Well, it's pretty obvious because people are hitting deadlines, they're submitting reports, they're making sure conferences happen. So it's pretty obvious if you're paying attention that people are getting their work done. So I think any organization, whether it's brick and mortar or hybrid or completely virtual, can be the prepared organization. And as you've already said, that organization needs to follow its unique identity. Not every organization wants to be fully remote. Some people, they're the kind of team they want to see each other a couple days a week. And that's great, if you understand that. So there isn't, and again, repeating what you've already said, Michael, there isn't a one size fits all for any organization. And so doing that, but I do think it was kind of sad that we lost some of that agility and innovative approach to solving problems during the lockdown. I know it was a big shock for a lot of people. But I think everybody's kind of like, oh, well, now we can go back to normal. And it's like, well, normal wasn't necessarily that great either. So, well,
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's been really interesting in the United States, and let me just say, I can sort of have some of these observations because I didn't grow up in the US. I grew up in Europe and in South Africa. So I kind of come into the US environment with an outsider's perspective. What was really interesting was the overlap of the pandemic with the rise in social and racial justice, right, following the murder of George Floyd. I think organizations got confronted by kind of a double set of challenges that were quite different in nature, but were both getting at the fundamental questions of who are you and how do you do what you do, right? My wife works in a museum. Now, museums, in her case, it's an art gallery. It's all about the portraits that are and the paintings that are in the gallery. So if you want to experience them, you would think you have to be in the gallery. During the pandemic, they were forced, as everybody was, to run these as virtual programming. The positive side of that for them was that they actually began having a global audience. People who would never be able to come into the museum for a program could join these virtual programs and experience what they had to offer. So that's that idea of pivoting, right? And it comes back to a purpose and identity. Do we go from being a very, very local organization in our city and make use of technology to maybe go national or even global, right? Is that in line with our purpose and identity? But at the same time, the sort of the social justice, the whole attention around DEI has us being able to ask questions around who benefits from certain ways of doing things, who gets excluded, right? What do we need to be doing differently in a way that promotes inclusion and belonging and equity within our organizations and with the communities that we serve? So disruption and crisis can actually be wonderful gifts. But I think, again, I want to kind of come back to my core point. You can navigate a crisis if you have a good sense of your purpose and identity, right? That might have to shift, but at least you knowingly and intentionally might shift your purpose in response to the crisis, as opposed to just being turned upside down and left confused as to how are you supposed to respond and what do you do when everything around you that's familiar has been disrupted.
Right. Well, and I think that's a really good point because you're right. That was a real double whammy for the United States, a significant lockdown and then so much social unrest at the same time, so many things coming at you from different directions and trying to figure out, well, how are we going to put on our annual conference when we're trying to process all these other things that are going on and, talk about identity. Every country goes through times where they have to reassess who we are and what do we stand for. And so that's what's happening in the United States right now. We're not a very old country like some other countries, but we've been through several identity crises in this country since we were founded. So having to go through that, going through those growing pains, yes, very difficult. And I think if you're a leader of an organization, what you said, not just identity of the organization, like the idea of the organization and what it stands for, but the people on the team and in your volunteer leadership, also knowing who the organization is and who they are and what's the example we want to set in this time of crisis. And it really does test your mettle. It really shows you who you are as an organization and as people, I think. But again, your concept of the prepared organization, even if it's a crisis, you're ready you know you can handle it. And will every step be a good step forward? No, everybody makes missteps, but that's okay because if you're prepared, you know when to shift again, know when to make a course correction. And speaking of the prepared organization, you said you were inspired to that name by one of your favorite quotes from Louis Pasteur. So I would love it if you could share it with the audience.
Yes, I was trying to remember, when I was doing this research, I said there's something there about being prepared, and I had to turn to Google because I couldn't remember what it was.
Mhm.
But, Louis Pasteur was a French scientist in the 19th century, and he was once asked, how is it that you're able to be so successful in your scientific research? And he said, uh, chance favors the prepared mind.
Love that.
Right? So when you've done all sorts of work, all of a sudden, what looks like spontaneous chance things happen around you.
Mhm.
I think in the same way for organizations, that chance or fortune growth favors the prepared organization. That when you've got these elements in place, you'll be more ready, you're going to find opportunities. People will be attracted to you because they hear about you, your brand, your mission will be well communicated, and it'll draw people to support you, and you'll be ready to take these new investments and grow in a way that is sustainable with lasting impact.
That's a wonderful quote. I really like it. It's reminiscent of some other quotes, but I really like what Pasteur said. And for those of you in the audience who are wondering, well, what the heck did Louis Pasteur did? He created pasteurization, which helps stabilize milk so that it would stay fresh longer and it could be transported and also made it healthier for people to drink it. So every time you
Oh,
go back,
we would describe that, I think, as a lasting impact,
yeah, I
right?
think so. Right, because how many times did our mother say, go to the store and buy some milk? And
That's
you
right.
can because of
That's
Louis
right.
Pasteur. Well, this has just been such a great conversation. I've really enjoyed it and looking forward to having you back later in the year. We'll
Thank
let
you,
the audience
Cecilia.
wonder what we're going to talk about. But I always like to ask my guests, what is the one thought you would like the audience to take away today? And if they'd like to follow up with you and learn more about the prepared organization and the other things you do, how can they get in touch?
Yeah. So here's the thought to leave with the audience. A prepared organization has at its core a prepared leader, right?
Mhm.
The leader themselves needs to be ready and open and nimble and ready for change. And they've got to be able to then communicate the need for a change to their team, to their staff, to work out what services are no longer fit for this new environment. What do we want to do even better? So, it's not just about the whole organization. It's the head, the executive director, it's the senior leaders and everybody throughout it. Again, that work of being prepared for whatever's going to happen.
That's
So
great.
if people are curious about that or leadership or organizations,
Mhm.
I work with individual leaders. I do leadership coaching. I have programs for groups, group coaching, group learning programs, and I work with leadership teams very often because I think teams are the core of developing and preparing organizations.
Mhm.
You can come to my website. The company name is Randel Consulting Associates, and my website is RCA, the Randel Consulting Associates contracted, rcachangeadvisors.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, Michael Randel, and I'd love to be connected or chat with you in any way that you're interested and explore further.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Michael, for sharing this because I, as I've said earlier, I really love these kind of step-by-step processes because it helps people focus. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise on this topic.
Thank you, Cecilia, for the invitation today. It's been a great conversation, and I love just some of the examples and stories you were telling as well that sort of show the relevance of these ideas about organizations.
Thank you. And yes, it's really, I think we all want to grow, whether we're small or big. We want to see growth, and your approach, I think, is a really great one. So I appreciate you being on, and thank you again. So we have to go rogue for now, but we'll be back next time with another exciting episode. So if you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, please do, because you don't want to miss a thing as we're moving forward with season 6. If you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips Consulting and how we can help your organization bloom outside the box, check out our website, roguetulips.com. We're also getting our fall education schedule in order. So if you want to be up to date on what we're going to be offering this fall for people getting ready for credentialing exams, go to our website education page and fill out our notify me form, and we'll let you know as things develop. So that's all for this week. We'll be back next time. And on behalf of Michael and myself, we'll see you then.